Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. It's been a little while since we've had a regular episode, and a lot of that is because I have been trying to do kind of a deep dive to get a little bit more understanding and knowledge of the next subject that I want to tackle in a series over the next several podcast episodes. And that is learning about the great proletarian cultural revolution of China, how it came to reshape the cultural landscape of China, and what we can learn from examining the history of all the various social forces that came to a head in that very tumultuous time. And if you start Googling and looking around, right now, if you search Cultural Revolution in China, you're going to find that people are talking about it much more commonly, because some of the events that we have been seeing in Western countries have sort of a reminiscence of the Cultural Revolution. The last episode, we talked about how ideology and dogma play into individuals' identities and shape the narrative and give them motivation for various actions that they then take in their lives based on that ideology and dogma. And the Cultural Revolution is just a moment in human history where ideology was so high up on the motivating factors over the entire society that you kind of get to see it in almost its purest form. So if you take some time, find out who's talking about the Cultural Revolution, you're going to find that there are a few really vocal and powerful voices out there that happen to be Chinese immigrants who themselves grew up in the cultural milieu of the Cultural Revolution and have since come and made homes in America. We've got the opportunity to compare the different places and are speaking out about it now. And one of the voices that you will hear if you Google and look is Dr. Pingnan Shi. He goes by Dr. Ping, and he's got a couple of really powerful discussions that you can find him on various podcasts. One of them is really looking at what's happening in the discussions around critical theory and critical race theory, and finding how there are parallels between that ideology and what happened in the context of the Cultural Revolution. So I reached out to Dr. Ping, and he was kind enough to offer to come and share his experience, and I'm going to bring him on board right now. Dr. Ping, how are you doing?
Good. Hi. How are you doing, Jonathan?
I'm doing great. I'm
yeah.
so
Thank
glad
you for
you were.
having me. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for coming on. Now, I want to make sure I got your name correct, because I know you go by Dr. Ping, because I think it's
Right.
easier for
It's
Western
easy,
ears.
right. Exactly.
But can you just kind of give us a little bit of background of how what your experience was in the Cultural Revolution, how you came to America, and then we're going to explore a little bit about the historical context at the start of the Cultural Revolution, and then take a look at some oral histories. So where does your story start?
Well, I was born in 1963, and the Cultural Revolution started in 1966. So I was about 3 years old. But both my older brothers, they are old enough, and also my oldest sister, so they are old enough to be Red Guards, and
Hmm.
actually both my brothers have joined some kind of military groups during that time. And for me personally, it's because my dad was imprisoned because he was a party official, and during the Great Purge, like he was basically illegally imprisoned, and my family was kicked out from our apartment, and kind of expelled, I mean, to the countryside. So my mom
Hmm.
actually had to work in a factory cafeteria for a couple of years, and before my dad was eventually reinstalled back to his former post. Uh,
Hmm.
and and my what I can remember, actually, I mean, there's some bits and pieces before I started the elementary school. But when I started elementary school in 1970, and that is full blown, you know, uh, well, it, there's two things that happened. One is the Cultural Revolution, and a couple of years later, there is something called the Education Revolution. It's less known, but that's what we went through. Um, so everything is totally. So that experience kind of remind me of what's happening. It's basically.
So
Go
I
ahead.
was going to say, it sounds like by the time you were a little bit older and had entered school, it was kind of in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. And we'll get into kind of the different phases of the Cultural
Right.
Revolution in a little bit. Early on, there was marked by a great deal of violence.
Right.
And then the army was called in to quell some of that violence. They started sending some of the Red Guards out to the countryside.
Mm-hmm.
And that probably would have been around where you were starting to enter school once that the
Right.
most tumultuous time had ended.
Right.
What is the, like, by the time you entered school, the culture had already been kind of reshaped and reformed by the effects of that intense ideological purging that had happened in the most extreme times. What was life like at that time for you
Well,
in the earliest memories?
so starting in 1966, there is a 2-year time that all schools are shutting down. I mean, everywhere.
Mhm.
Universities and high school and middle school and all that, they all get shut down.
Was that
Then,
by government decree, or was that just the schools deciding on their own to do that?
well, because Chairman Mao unleashed the Red Guards, they actually bring destructions everywhere they went. So there is basically you won't be able to function.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's worth going into a definition here, because I have a bunch of misconceptions, since this is a chapter of world history that in America we don't really get exposed to.
Right.
When I hear the term Red Guard, I usually think, oh, that must be the military. Was the Red Guard a branch of the military,
No,
or
never.
what was the Red Guard?
Well, it started in the universities. Started in Tsinghua University and Beijing University. Those two, kind of like Ivy League universities in China, and then spread out to other colleges. So the first group of Red Guards, they were college students, and then they bring that this so-called Cultural Revolution to the high school and then to the middle schools. So
Okay.
the majority of the Red Guards are high school and middle school students, but it was
Okay,
started by the college students.
Okay, so that basically, if you want to conceptualize this to Western ears, it's not an official branch of the military.
No,
It's
never.
not even an official branch of the Communist Party itself.
No.
It's not within the party apparatus, because
No.
Mao called on the youth to form these organizations in a way to purge the party under him. And so they couldn't actually be in the authority of the party. They
Right.
had to be independent. And so it's basically a bunch of self-organized students who come together. And these aren't just any students. These are students who were born in the communist regime.
Mm-hmm.
The communists took power in 1949,
Right.
and they immediately underwent a socialist re-education program where they had all of the teachers become indoctrinated with socialist principles and ideas, and then had them instruct the youth in those ideals. So all of these youth had grown up idolizing Chairman Mao, and Mao Zedong thought being basically the ideology that their entire worldview was shaped by. So when he called on them, justified and legitimizing rebellion and saying bombard the headquarters and all the other buzzwords that we'll see, they took their orders directly from Mao, and he was basically saying a bunch of people who were trying to revise back to old capitalist ways had infiltrated the Communist Party.
Right.
So we've got to purge these people who are less than pure, according to Mao Zedong thought.
Yeah.
Okay.
So right, my dad at that time, he was a party official, so he was kind of high up in the local level. He was executive at a big factory. So he was imprisoned by the Red Guards during that purge. So basically, Mao used the Red Guards to overturn the whole party hierarchy.
I see. And so you grew up in the school system in the most tumultuous times. I know after a period of time, particularly after Mao died, a lot of the chaos of the Cultural Revolution died down. Again, we're going to dive into the specifics of this and look at some documentary film to go into it. How did you make your way to America?
Well, actually, I made my way to Canada first. So I went to college. Mao died in 1976. I went to college in 1978. So I started my school in 1970. I went to college in 78. So I only have 8 years before I went to school, college. And then that was then was in charge. He actually is trying to open up China to the outside world. And well,
you're referring to Deng Xiaoping, who
Deng
took
Xiaoping,
over,
okay, right?
Yeah, after Mao died, and he started to do a lot of the things that Mao had originally started the Cultural Revolution to undo, which is he started to introduce more market capitalist principles, blending them with, the Communist Party itself to try to overcome all of the famine that took place in the Great Leap Forward. And we'll get into all these details in a little bit. But so you were a young man. Was this college that you went to in China, or had you studied abroad?
In China,
Okay.
Actually, China opened up in early 1980s. So it's about time I graduate from college. So I won a scholarship from the Chinese government, and so I was sent to Canada to study engineering. So I was kind of, a number in their 5-year plan. They decide how many people they send out to the Western world to learn technologies, to learn engineering, and then we were supposed to go back and to help to build China.
So did that happen? Did you end up going back, or what
what happened?
Did you take from?
Well, what happened is 1989, the Tiananmen Square massacre, the June 4th, and the Chinese government actually sent soldiers to clear the Tiananmen Square. So they killed a lot of people. I mean, until this day, we don't know how many, but the estimation is about like 10,000 in that range.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. And so basically, people like me who are in the West, in Canada, in the US, we cannot go back. And so
was it that you felt like you couldn't go back, or the government didn't want you, and you had been contaminated with Western ideas? They didn't want you coming back.
Well, it's because a lot of us actually were supporting the movement.
Okay.
Because like my generation were kind of came to age during the time that we are trying to open the China outside, trying to become more democratic. And of course, we support the students on the square, because that was a huge movement. That was a student-led movement, and because our activities, like my wife and I were very active, so we were put on the blacklist, and so we just if we went back at that time, we probably get we will be put in jail.
Oh, really? So did you apply for refugee status, or how did you enter the new world here?
Canada actually allowed us to stay, even though we, in fact, is political refugees, but the Canadian government didn't call that way. It just kind of, allowed us to stay, but not calling us as refugees, because they still don't want to offend the Chinese government.
Oh, I see. So
Yeah.
it was kind of just like you can stay extended visa as long as you're here, and then
Well,
there's a
you can.
pathway to citizenship for you as well.
Well, actually, at that time, they opened up the green card
Oh, okay.
pass to us. So most of us, pretty much all of us who were in Canada at that time, applied the green card.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
And where do you find yourself now? Did you stay in Canada? Are you in the U.S. now, or
I'm
what was
in
your
the
journey
U.S.
after that?
Actually, I finished my PhD in 1991, and I worked 4 years, and then I find a job in Indianapolis. So I came to
Hmm.
the U.S. in 1995. Right. So I'm a Canadian citizen and also a U.S. citizen, kind of a dual citizenship.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you grew up in a school system that was heavily steeped in communism
Hmm.
and socialist ideals.
Hmm.
When did you first see the difference in the way that the Western world thought in terms of capitalism, and how did you reconcile those things when you were first exposed to those ideas?
Yeah, that was during my college years. So we have access to the outside, even though not as much as we would like to, but we were able to kind of listening to the Voice America and things like that. And also starting to there are some magazines that they translate um, Western like stories, short stories, or long story, novels and all that. So that's how I got to see what's actually outside. Um, and also during that time, many people are starting to reflect, trying to figure out what went wrong.
Mhm.
It's kind of like just like how to say, in a way, like kind of like you get drunk, right? And then you wake up the next day, you try and say what happened and what how do I got there.
Mhm.
So that was a period a lot of Chinese, especially intellectuals and
Mhm.
students, were doing the soul searching and trying to figure out what happened. Because um, when you say bad things happen in the Cultural Revolution, uh, none of us are really innocent, right? I mean, like when I was a student, I participate in those kind of activities, right? We're trying to criticize
Mhm.
our teachers, um, went to rallies and all that, and
Yeah.
we thought we are doing the right thing. Um, and but once Mao died, then there are people who are starting to share their experience, their stories, which is totally different from what we, uh, you know, um, perceived or
Yeah.
imagined. And that's where people got waking up, say, "Oh, what happened?" The government actually lied to us, and if
Mm.
they lied to us in such a way, what else? Uh, what else they lied us to, right? It's starting to
Yeah.
figure out what's going on here. Yeah,
No, I think my audience will be able to relate to that experience. If you're in a religious institution that shapes your entire worldview, defines good and
right,
bad, and then tells you that your goodness is amplified by your, willingness to act on your convictions, then that type of wiring in human history has gone to extremes, leading people to do things that they think are acting out of righteousness. Then later on, they reflect that they had been deceived,
right,
misled, and drawn into a social movement that was powered by its own, righteous moral outrage that leads them to do things that they, on reflection, should not have done and regret. And
right,
we'll see some examples of that. I think that statement that you made, where we were all guilty. Almost every person that I've listened to who survived through the Cultural Revolution even in the midst of them talking about how bad some of the things were, they always say, I participated as well.
Right.
I was swept up in it and I regret it. I feel
Right.
so terrible about my,
Yeah.
whether it's a child who denounced their parents and their parents were taken off and in some
Yeah.
cases killed, or even the loss of a beloved teacher because of being
Right.
swept up into these things.
Right.
Well, I think it's a good idea, now that we're familiar with your story a little bit more, to go back in. And what I want to do is kind of go back to the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. And you can't even start there. You've got to know why it is that Mao believes that it's so important to return and to sort of purify the Communist Party and purify the culture, because it seems to be doing things against what his original ideas are. And in order for you to know that, you have to go back and see, well, what is it that happened before the Cultural Revolution? And you kind of have to go back to the beginning of where in the world is Mao getting his ideas in the first place.
Right.
And I think it's important to see that early on, the early 20th century saw China transition from its multi-centuries old tradition of different empires holding control over the country to having a revolution where there's a nationalist movement that's trying to adopt some Western conceptions of government into the nation. A lot of warring factions happen. You have, the nation under Chiang Kai-shek, I think, was the guy that really did a great deal of that. And you've got these nationalists and communists who at the same time are vying for power. And there's a great civil war that happens. It's interrupted a little bit as Japan invades China, and the communists who had been marginalized but were still kind of engaged with the nationalists decide to unify so that they can confront Japan's invasion in the context of World War II. And they're drawn into World War II. The U.S. ends up facilitating the surrender of Japan by employing the nuclear weapons that they did. And that then leaves China to contend now with these factions that were cooperating against Japan at that time. But now the communists are looking for power, the nationalists are looking for power, and the communists end up victorious. And the nationalist government is pushed out into Taiwan. They had been receiving a great deal of help from the U.S. and other Western allies. And there were problems with corruption. There were problems with them basically misappropriating and misusing those resources. And so all of that corruption played into the communists taking power, saying, we're going to reform, everything's going to be great. And so Mao Zedong, 1949, takes power. And one of the first things that he does is a trip to Moscow so that he can unite with his friends in the area. His entire ideology that he and the communists have was shaped on Marxist ideals. Now, just as in Russia, Lenin adapted the political philosophy of Marxism and all of its implications into economics and everything else to the Russian culture. In China, Mao did the same thing. He took Marxist ideas, he took the lessons of Lenin and Stalin and adapted them to Chinese culture. So it had its own unique spin, its own unique signature that was marked by the way that the Chinese understand these ideas. And Mao was a master of integrating those two things so that the Chinese people would accept those ideas in a way that made sense to them. Whereas if he tried to simply translate by rote Marxist Leninism, Leninist Marxism into China, it wouldn't mesh as much. But Mao was able to brilliantly make this work so that people accepted it. They had already been burned by the nationalists, and so he came to power, and they did that. Now, I think it's important early on. I have clipped certain parts of various documentaries that I think really focus on these things, and I want to bring a clip into play now. Let me pull up here. And if there's anything that you want to add to some of these things that I've mentioned, then by all means do so.
Sure.
Let's see here. So this is a brief excerpt from Mao's first trip. Okay, so here we go.
In the winter of 1949, Mao arrived for his first official visit in Moscow. The Chinese Peasants' Revolution had been eyed with suspicion agents to try to bring their influence to bear. In particular, they did not shy from criticism of the Chinese regime. Relations between the Communist Party led by Mao and the Soviet Union led by Stalin were under strain. Mao sought financial and economic aid. However, he would never allow Moscow to assume the leadership role, nor would he accept the role of a junior partner or even satellite state. From the outset, the relationship was marked by rivalry. Mao sensed a threat when Khrushchev knocked Stalin off his pedestal, exposing his crimes. Moscow and Beijing soon drifted apart.
Okay, so there's a transition there that I want to make sure that we talk about a little bit. So in 1949, we have Mao very much aligned with Stalin, who he saw as his counterpart in Russia.
Oh, Jonathan, there is an echo going on.
Okay, let me see what I can do to fix that. Thank you for letting me know.
Oh, no problem.
Okay, all right. All right, is that better?
Yep.
Test
Oh,
one,
better.
two. Okay.
Right.
Okay,
Well,
excellent.
Yeah, there is there is one thing that few Americans are aware of, because the Chinese Communist Party under Mao, they were very smart, very strategic, and so they are trying to make them into. They are trying to basically they told the West that they are not going to do a Soviet style communism. They are actually going to do something like America's democracy, and they have a lot of people in the U.S. government who are sympathetic to them. There is a very famous biography was written by Edgar Snow. I don't know if you know that person. Very famous book. It's called Red Star Arise in China, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, and people like him and other journalists basically sold to the American public that the Chinese Communist Party is not like the Soviet, because by that time people know how bad communism was in the Soviet, right? And so they actually portray themselves as someone more modest, and they are trying to really build a coalition. I mean, at the first they pretend to do that. They are trying to be, just have a democracy.
So I think it's worth talking now. When we look back on history now, we already have an established knowledge base of some of the atrocities that happened under these various different communist regimes.
Right.
But while they were happening in the moment, the world did not have that information, because the governments in power used propaganda not only to their own people, but to the world itself. And so they claimed that they were going to collectivize these farms and collectivize their entire agricultural and industrial systems, and that was going to produce so much. And people on the outside that agreed with these ideals very much bought into that, and they wanted them to succeed. Right. And that's where in Russia, the way that they ended up, there's something, if you just Google Holodomor, then there was a great famine that was the result of these collectivizations that had to be implemented by force, that ended up, starving out huge segments of their population. But they hid the reality of that from the world, and U.S. journalists were complicit in hiding of it. Right. So China itself probably was believing a lot of the propaganda that happened, and didn't, they probably were learning that as well at the same time as everyone else.
Right. Actually, there is one journalist, I think it's New York Times, Moscow bureau,
Durante,
station chief. So he basically lied for Stalin. He told that what's happening in Ukraine is just being exaggerated. I mean, um, he said that he actually went there. I mean, he did investigation, nothing like that. And
Yeah.
so he actually wrote a lot of articles, and for that he actually got a Pulitzer Award.
Yep.
So talking about things, I
There's
mean,
there's a fantastic movie called Mr. Jones
yeah,
that you can look, where there's an independent journalist that makes his way into Russia, manages to get on a train that's going to this part of the Ukraine where they were having mass starvation, sees that people are so hungry and starved that they're resorting to cannibalism.
right,
And he comes out and he writes a report to it, but he is then demonized by the widespread press. And again,
right,
these are all intellectuals in America, many of whom want socialism to succeed because they see
right,
socialism as the correct political ideology for the world.
right,
And so that concept where your ideology starts to shape how you act is very much taking hold of the people who want communism and socialism to
right,
succeed in the West and affecting how they engage in journalism.
right.
And so that I think that's important to keep in mind when you look at this history.
Right,
So early on,
and we talk about like when the nationalists during the Civil War, and if the American government wanted to support Chiang Kai-shek, then Chiang Kai-shek could still stay in power. Won't lose that badly. I mean, it's cooperative government, definitely, but they in a way, it's well, it's very hard to say. It's kind of like a Vietnam War, is that the American public didn't want to get involved. You know what I mean? Because they saw a lot of bad things about the nationalist government, but they haven't heard any bad things about the Chinese Communist Party. So as American, we definitely don't want to,
right.
to
And that's at a time where we haven't yet learned of the atrocities of Stalinist Russia.
Right.
And so we just assume that, and if they've heard about the corruption of the nationalists, and they just assume, well, the communists are coming in and they're going to have the same success in China that Stalin has had in Russia.
Right. Yeah.
And this then now brings us to this next chapter where Mao has really modeled a lot of his activities. There's one documentary that mentions that Stalin, in his communications with Mao, says, you really should not collectivize the farms. And he's alluding to the fact that they had just a disastrous output. But Mao says, no, we are that is absolutely going to be that, because that is consistent with my communist vision for how I believe politics should work. And so we'll see the result of that in a little bit. But before we do, we need to confront what Mao saw as Stalin died and Nikita Khrushchev took over in Russia. Because if you just Google the secret speech of Nikita Khrushchev, one of the things that happened early on in his reign in Russia was that he held a meeting with the highest party leaders and he denounced Stalin and all of the very violent, aggressive, authoritarian things that Stalin did, and basically laid a lot of the blame for all of the chaos, all of the death, all the destruction that was happening on that. And he started to reverse a lot of those policies. And it was a concept that then came to be understood as thermidor, which was a reference to the French Revolution, where when you engage in revolution to overturn the political landscape, ideologically speaking, and you're moving to socialize and collectivize everything, and then it's not working. And then people say, well, maybe we should return to some of those market forces, return to some of the things that we had before. You start to weaken the ideological fervor that drove your revolution. And it was described as thermidor because about 11 months into the French Revolution that happened. But people acting in Russian Revolution, writing and talking about it, said this phenomenon of backtracking and resorting back to those old bourgeoisie or capitalist ways is something we need to watch for. Mao would have seen what happened with Khrushchev denouncing Stalin and saying, well, this is now, Khrushchev was kind of Stalin's right-hand man, and now he's turned on him. He betrayed his legacy, and he started to backtrack on some of these ideals. I don't want that to happen to me in China. And so that is something that perhaps caused him a little bit of anxiety. Now, there was a movement that happened in Russia where people started to really push back violently against the authoritarian regime, the communists there. And I think it was Czechoslovakia. There's one nation that really entered into trying to get themselves out from under that boot. And there was a period of time where historians say that Mao saw that people's inability to criticize the government led to them having these violent actions. And so he thought, well, what we can do is we can normalize a certain level of criticism of the government so that people can get their frustrations out, and that will make them more compliant. And so in this period of time in China, there were wave after wave of political campaigns. There would be slogans, propaganda, posters saying, okay, this is the government program we're going to do now. This is some new thing. And one of them that left, I think, a significant footprint in the mind of people who lived through it was the 100 Flowers campaign. Now, the 100 Flowers campaign was where that hard line where you don't say anything bad about the government. If you do, you're going to be subject to imprisonment or retaliation. That was softened. And Mao's quote is that we actually want 100 flowers of different ideas to bloom. Let's make it okay for you to criticize the policies, because maybe we'll find better policies. So 100 flowers to bloom, 100 ideas to contend. And then people in the universities and in communities felt that it was safe for a little bit to raise criticisms of the party. And historians have said, well, this was an idea that was going to maybe open up the society a little bit and allow it to improve, but things didn't quite turn out that way. I don't think I have a clip for this particular thing, but what ended up happening, what is your recollection of that? Or have you encountered that?
I was too young for that. I can't just start
this was before your time.
Yeah, started on my own on the history of that. But if you look back, that was what the Mao promised to the intellectuals. He actually, the first government he set up, there are a lot of like ministry level people who are not communists, because he promised that. He promised, okay, we'll be a lot more democratic. We won't be like the Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek basically was a dictator. I mean, he was. So he said, we can do better. Our Chinese Communist Party can do better. So they promised a democratic government. And so when he said the 100 flowers and to bloom, and the Chinese intellectuals kind of just took his word for it and say, okay, if he promised this, then let's just have, let's have a democracy. But of course, things turned out very bloody and very tragic.
Yeah. So
for those,
my understanding is that intellectuals started to say, okay, not only we are going to criticize how policies are implemented, we're actually going to criticize the very foundation of Mao Zedong thought, the very concept of Marxism and socialism and communism. We're going to criticize the legitimacy of that at its core. And not only that, but very vocally and directly criticize Mao. And as soon as that was breached, then that policy of openness was reversed. And then everybody who essentially gave the state evidence to convict them and crack down on them by giving their opinion was subject to retaliation.
And that was that was after the Communist Party shut down the church. The first thing they did is to shut down the churches and to control whatever, control the leadership, the pastors and all that. And at that time, most Chinese intellectuals are okay with it, because most of them were not Christians. So they are more kind of Western educated, believing a theory of evolution and there was no God and all that. And so they were okay with it. But now, when it's their turn, they had no one to protect them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's nothing there for them to kind of to take a shelter. So they just been kind of being persecuted for their liberal ideas.
I think it's worth pointing out, as you're bringing up these various things, that democracy itself does not mean civil liberties. It doesn't mean human rights. Democracy just means that we are going to exercise power under this notion that the will of the people becomes manifest in government through voting. Where you can see there's all kinds of totalitarian dictatorships around the world that insert the word democracy or republic into their words, the DPRK all these ones, they'll say democracy, but that does not mean that there's a concept of human rights or that there's any constraint on the government. And even as we talk about China eventually adopting capitalism as part of their economic machinery, that does not mean that they have the civil liberties that we may understand are inherent to capitalism in Western civilization.
Yeah, their logic is kind of twisted, because they said that the Chinese Communist Party represent the majorities of Chinese people. So therefore, democracy means the majority rule, and we are representing the majority. So therefore, we rule.
Well, and that's the thing where I guess, people in America, we like to say, democracy is, 3 wolves and a sheep voting on what to have for dinner. And while, we have a constitutional republic in which the Constitution prescribes limitations on what the government can do. And that's where those civil liberties that pre-exist the government are restrain what the government can do. And there's a very important distinction to be made there. So like when you say the communists go into power, they immediately start removing some of the church and the longstanding religious and cultural traditions in China. They're violating civil liberties there. And maybe the intellectuals, the atheists, they're like, I'm not a Buddhist, I'm not a Confucian, I don't really practice Confucianism, so that's fine. But then as soon as the state then uses that same power to purge them, if they speak out against them, then you're seeing the repercussions of that.
Exactly.
So while we're addressing this, let's go back and finish this moment about Mao, because this idea that Mao gets, where there's, he's got a legacy. He's transformed the landscape politically of China, but Russia has shown that Stalin got kind of stabbed in the back after he died by this Khrushchev, and that started to insert a degree of paranoia into how Mao perceived the political landscape. And let's take a look at that. So I think we might have to back up a little bit here. Let's see. We'll just take it from boop, boop, boop. All right, here we go.
Mao sensed a threat when Khrushchev knocked Stalin off his pedestal, exposing his crimes. Moscow and Beijing soon drifted apart. Under Khrushchev's leadership, the Soviet Union strove to lead the world economy, even hoping to reap material gains for its own populace. Mao, for his part, wanted China to be the avant-garde of the global revolution and to change the face of the earth. Khrushchev had dethroned Stalin and destroyed his historical image. Could he, Mao, one day face a similar fate? Mao's prestige had suffered serious damage from the catastrophe of the Great Leap. He was afraid that he too might end up on the political scrap heap.
Okay.
He just could not conceive how such a thing could happen in the Soviet Union.
Okay, so they've introduced now something that we need to understand, and that is the Great Leap Forward. They mentioned that after Stalin died, Khrushchev was ambitious in his desire to transform how Russia, where its standing was on the world stage. Russia had started their own collectivization, their own 5-year plan series. And one thing that you'll notice is a lot of the things that happen in China happen a few years earlier in Russia. And Mao ends up actually adopting some of the same names.
Oh, yeah.
So so you'll hear things like 5-year plan, even
Right.
Red Guard. When you look in the history of China, Red Guard was a phenomenon that occurred in Russia in their revolution, and it has some of the same footprints and fingerprints that the way that it was implemented in China. So one of these, Russia says that we're going to, make more, we're going to have a bigger footprint economically in the realm of industrialization than
Right.
America. China says, well, we're going to do better than Britain. Britain was, in
Right.
the ascendant at that time. And so he goes into doing kind of the same thing where now that the state has power, they are going to tell you what to do. So
Right.
when the communists took over, China was pretty much an agricultural society. There were landlords who owned larger plots of land, and people would rent smaller plots of land on there. There was a lot of resentment. Some of the landlords, probably a lot of the landlords, were corrupt and took advantage of their power. When the communists came in, they said, you guys can take that land from your landlords. And we see some premonition of what we're going to see in struggle sessions in the Cultural Revolution by the way that the landlords themselves took power, where the landlords are drug out in front of all of the people. They are denounced. They are told that they're, in alignment with old capitalist bourgeoisie ways, and the land, their deeds are burned up, and the land is distributed to the peasants. And we use the word peasants not as a pejorative, but just to say the people who are the active farmers in this agricultural landscape at the time.
Yeah.
And then now, and that's, when the communists first come into power, that's in the 1949, early 1950s. And now that Mao wants to reshape how China stands in the world economy and industrialize, there's a bunch of inputs into creating these large city centers that may have large industrial complexes. They're importing a lot of heavy machinery from Russia, and they've got to support and feed these city centers, and grain is the key to it all. And so his solution involves collectivization, which is that now, since the state had the power to support the peasants in destroying the deeds and taking land from the landlords, the state now has the power to take all that land from the peasants and say, now this is all communal property. You don't have any private property.
Right.
We will set up cafeterias. You get your food from the state. You go out and you farm. Right. It removes the profit incentive now. So people can't do anything. They can't work harder and save for themselves. They have to work, give it over to the state, and then the state gives them back food in the form of the communal cafeterias. And
it kind of sounds like crazy especially to Americans, but that's one of the core talents of communism. I mean, that's why they call it communism, because of these communes. Right. I mean, that's how their way of how to, because they do truly believe that way they can to build a lot more wealth and for the common people, right, for the community, right. And so they truly believe that if instead of some landlords to have their private property, they want the government to control everything. So one of the talents in communism is to abolish private properties. So this is just basically the Soviet Union practiced on that, and it was disastrous. And the Mao practiced that, and that was disastrous. Yeah, so let's watch the next segment now, which is about the Great Leap Forward, which was the slogan of this political campaign of Mao to try to bring China out of the agricultural age into the industrial age.
Only on one occasion in 1958 did Mao let himself be tempted into economic competition with the West, so as not to leave the field to the Soviet Union alone. In the Great Leap Forward, even the villages were roped into steel production in a scheme designed to outstrip British production within the space of a few years. The more the party got itself caught up in a frenzy of successful statistics, the faster the situation in the countryside was approaching catastrophe. It wasn't steel or iron that they were producing, it was scrap. The products of their labor were simply not suitable for processing. The village foundries led to no significant improvement in the technological capabilities of the communes. In fact, they actually destroyed it. The industrial catastrophe went hand in hand with two failed harvests that drove China to the verge of ruin. Over 20 million people died of starvation as a result of the so-called Great Leap Forward.
The Great Leap Forward was the only campaign up to that point that Mao personally directed. The campaign failed miserably, and the consequences were dire. It has taken me a decade to work out the number of people who died of starvation. According to my estimates, it was somewhere between 20 and 30 million.
The worst thing we ever experienced was the effect of the Great Famine in the early 60s. There were about 200 people in our village, and at least half of them starved to death in that famine.
Okay, so that covered the steel production part of it, because in addition to having centers of industrialized steel plants, he also said we need, if we have all of our villages have their own steel furnaces and take any raw materials they can, melt it down and send it to our large centers, then we can produce such enormous production in our steel output that will overwhelm the West. And but it turned out that that was not the case. It was an example of failure of central planning, where government bureaucrats think that they can direct the economy and direct industry by only having a limited knowledge of all the inputs that go into it. And it was a massive failure because all of those people that diverted their resources, their time and energy from farming into that steel production contributed to the famine. But at the same time, it was amplified because the propaganda from the government continued to claim that it was a success. And this is the second part of that. Let's see if we go to the famine report. Let's look at.
Yeah. Well, there's also how to say, when they said trying to find the whatever raw material they can get, they basically just confiscate people's like pots and you know what I mean, anything like iron or something. They just kind of recycle.
They assumed if it was metal, we can melt it down and send it, but it ended up being slag that was not you couldn't be useful for anything that they actually would have used it for.
Right. And also the people who is running the local communes or local villages, they exaggerate because they were afraid that if they tell the truth, they will be, you know, they will be well, either
they'll be held accountable, you know, if they don't meet their quotas, and so they've got to surpass the quota. And if you're reporting and the guy before you reported that he surpassed his quota by 50%, then you've got to surpass it by more. There's this competition to be the most successful. So that effect, along with the propaganda, I think is really important to understand. So there's an example here of what the propaganda was at the time. Let's take a listen.
The rural district of Xianyang, 500 miles south of Beijing, was chosen as a national model. In 1958, more than 1 million officials from every part of the country visited the area. This propaganda film from the time extolled the district's achievements, showing the exemplary benefits the commune system could bring if enforced with proper zeal. Its glowing images were given the lie by the reality that lay behind. Officially, there are record harvests, grain in abundance. Communal kitchens supply the peasants' every want. In real life, there is nothing.
But the 活人也有，甚至最极端是吃自己的孩子也有。僧人走路的僧人饿了不走不动了，就可能被人吃掉了。同位说我们不怕死人，怕活人。死人到处都是啊，活人的老婆还被你吃掉了。
No pictures of the famine exist, not even a single photograph. None was ever taken. It remained a deathly secret, masked by images of plenty. Mao knew that if the truth got out, Beijing's enemies would gloat over the suffering his policies had caused. In Xinjiang, the model district, 1 million people, 1 in 8 of the population, starved to death. In 1960, 3 senior government officials made a detailed analysis of the population figures.
他们3个人搞了个调查材料，当时全国人口减少几千万。当时向周恩来汇报，周恩来只报2个人，只报周恩来、毛泽东，周恩来就是马上销毁。当时60年是知道的，那么严重程度，上千万人死亡是知道的。
All right. So that was just an example of the propaganda. And I think to give a little bit more color and depiction of the dire straits that people were in the midst of all this, where, you know, the one researcher that was talking told of accounts of cannibalism,
right,
where people even just to survive ate their own children. And that may not be that they killed their child to eat, but it may be that it was estimated that something like half of the tens of millions of people that died were under the age of 10, children dying of starvation. And if your child died and your family was hungry, then that was potential food for you. And when people are faced by starvation for which they have no other options, you know, dire things happen. And we saw it in Russia, and it was just reproducing itself here in China.
And the thing is, it's totally unnecessary. It's because just Mao wants to save his face. So,
yes.
And he actually refused aids from the international community. I know that like Canadian government and U.S. government all said, we can give you food. We know you guys have starvation, but the Chinese government said, no.
Right. And there were examples even of China donating food to other countries just to prove their excess. Yeah. And the things that you were mentioning before about officials falsely reporting their statistics. You know, these communes are organized, and each of them has a party member that's in charge of both making sure that the quotas get met, that people go out and work, and then reporting those numbers up. And those people have managers who have managers. Right. And across the entire country, people were falsely representing what it was because nobody wanted to admit that the system was not working, because then they themselves might be subject to political purging, to imprisonment.
Right. And also every level can exaggerate the figure. So you can go through all the levels, like you're talking about like probably 10 times or 100 times what actually was really producing.
Yeah. Yeah, and that whole thing where you're in the system, you're one of the leaders of the system, and your mind is completely shaped by the ideology, and you believe it's going to work. People under you are telling you data and figures. Right. And so when they talk about these 2 officials or 3 officials that produced a report, and that report eventually made it not to Mao, but to Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping, and they saw it, but they said, we need to suppress this information. And then it was the head of state, I think, who eventually went out to the countryside and was like, what's going on? And everyone's like, oh, it's just a drought. And he's like, no, I grew up in this area. If it's a drought, the lakes and the rivers would be dry. They're half full. There's something more. And then they finally tell him that it's this communal system that is just decimating everything. Right. And they say it's like 70% man-made catastrophe, 30% natural catastrophe. And that 70-30 split is usually one that's used to try to admit some fault, but it's usually, 70% success, 30% things we could have done better. This was an inversion of it. And when in a later party meeting, they confront Mao with this thing, this is a man-made disaster that is the result of this program that you specifically implemented under the umbrella of Mao Zedong thought and socialism, communism, that has led to the deaths of tens of millions of people. That's when, I think Mao is first really marginalized.
Yeah, he actually was forced to apologize to the party. I think there was a party congress or something like that, about like 7,000 attendants. He actually apologized, and in that conference.
Now, when historians describe that apology, they describe it as a self-criticism, and they usually say that there's a long-standing Chinese cultural tradition of self-criticism. Is that something that you're familiar with, or that you can explain somewhat?
Well, in the Chinese history, like when something like this happens, the emperor normally will admit his fault. Is basically self-criticize him and asking for forgiveness from the heaven. Yeah, so it definitely had that tradition.
Because I get the sense when you read about that longstanding tradition, how even party members themselves, I think up until this point, Mao had forced a lot of his underlings to perform self-criticisms when they failed, or when the blame for a program could be pinned on an underling. Then he would have the underling stand up and give a self-criticism and humiliate themselves in front of the entire party apparatus. And this was the first time that Mao himself was compelled to do that. At that time, he was head of the state and chairman of the party itself. And he stepped down, or was placed down in the second row or the second seat. And I think it was Zhou Enlai that took over as head of state. I may have that name wrong.
No, Liu Shaoqi.
Oh, okay.
Liu
Shaoqi.
Yeah.
Okay. And then he maintained his role as the chairman of the party, but he was no longer head of state, because it was a one party state, but there was a division there between the party hierarchy and the state hierarchy.
Yeah.
You have to forgive my dog.
Yeah. So basically, he was giving an honorable position, but no power.
Right. And so that 1958 is when the Great Leap Forward starts. Over the next 3 years or so, there's just massive famine, tens of millions of death. I think it's 1962 or so when Mao has to perform his self-criticism, when a bit of this information, they're still not open to the world, the national stage, about the degree of the tragedy, because of what it would mean for their whole entire ideological project. But it now puts Mao on the defensive, because now the people who were his underlings, who are now taking that center stage, have a reason to point to him and say these problems are because of him. And that would then serve a justification, because yes, this famine is happening. How do we get out of it? If this communal system of the Great Leap Forward is the problem, then we've got to reverse it. We've got to go back to some of the pre-existing structures that allowed our country to generate the grain that was necessary.
Right. And the thing is, there was no widespread famine. That's totally a lie, fabricated by the Chinese Communist Party.
What do you mean?
Well, I was born in a province called Sichuan Province. It's known as the greenery of China, very rich soil.
Kind of like the breadbasket of America.
Kind of like Ukraine. Ukraine was called the greenery of Europe, and because of the policy, they had the starvation, so they can blame on the famine. But in the province, Sichuan Province, we never have anything. We never had any famine. I mean, there might be some localized incidents in the whole China, but they just totally exaggerated. I mean,
so how does that fit with the narrative that a lot of people have of there being widespread famine? Was it because the communes worked in that region? Or I know that Frank Decatur is one of the researchers who's really dove into the records at local levels. And he's set up a paradigm where there were a lot of black markets that started to flourish, where people would unofficially do market capitalism, or, you know, they would do market activities and hide it from the authorities. And that was one way that people survived. How did people survive in the midst of this communal project in the breadbasket of China, as you're describing?
Well, it definitely is a lot of those so-called things going on in the black market. And what happened to Sichuan province, the starvation is because all the produce in that province was taken by the government, so they have to like send whatever they have to the central government. So they couldn't have anything. Not enough left for them to eat.
This was you're referring to the quotas, where the government said you have to export so much grain, and then you can keep anything in surplus of that. But then the state continued to raise those quotas because everyone was reporting that they'd have it, and eventually they just gave all the grain. They didn't have anything for themselves.
Right.
But that was happening in the wider China area, in areas that were affected by famine. But you're describing a central area that did not have that same sort of famine. No. How did they survive?
Well, they eat. They basically eat grass, eat tree barks, anything they can get hands on. And some actually resorted to eat some kind of white clay.
Yeah.
And you die. Once you get there, you'll die. It makes you feel better because the hunger, it's very hard to
it fills your stomach, but it doesn't actually provide nutrition.
Right. Yeah, it's very hard to explain that if you never experienced hunger.
Okay, so I want to understand, because you started out saying that there was no widespread famine.
No.
So where was there not famine? Because it sounds like there was famine certainly in areas where they are resorting to eating clay or eating bark. People would say those are famine conditions.
No, that's what I said happening in Sichuan province. People eat like the tree barks and clays. There was no famine.
Okay, maybe there's a definitional difference here. So when I say famine, I'm usually talking about areas where food is so scarce that they're resorting to eating non things. What do you mean by that, or are you trying to use a different word other than famine?
Well, the land actually produce. Sichuan actually is pretty.
I think I know what you mean. Okay, it wasn't that there was a drought. Like the conditions couldn't produce grain. It's that the economic system of these communes and the disruption of normal economic activity made it so that agricultural didn't produce what it optimally could. But that was all a man-made disaster. It was not a natural disaster.
Right. Not a natural. Right.
Okay, there was no drought.
No drought, and also because definitely the wide range of hunger. If you say famine is because of that, yes, but not because the land was not producing. Because
I see.
Whatever was produced was taken by the government.
All right, and I understand what you meant now. Right. Yeah, by famine, you're saying the natural disaster part of it. It was all a man-made disaster. Okay, so
I should.
So now,
Thank you.
So now we've got. No, that's okay. I think going down that road actually helped us understand a little bit more of what was actually going on. So now we've got the massive failure of the Great Leap Forward. Mao is now kind of relegated to the countryside. He kind of takes a tour by train of the nation, and he starts to see that the new people who have taken over have started to undo his communist paradigm. And have started to say, okay, now farmers can own a little bit of land. They can keep some of their own grain, and markets can come back in where people are able to set prices. People are able to sell their labor, all of these different things that are much more capitalist, definitely not communist, socialist. And he just sees that as backtracking. And not only that, but these people who have taken over, who used to be his, second in command, are undoing some of his project. And he's starting to say, wait a second, there's some parallels here with how Khrushchev was undoing and basically dragged Stalin and blamed all of the failures on Stalin. And this is now a motivation for him to find some way to return to power and to try to recapture that position where he can shape the nation according to his ideology.
Right.
All right. So anything that you want to add to that before we get to the
no, well, yeah, I'm good.
The beginning of the Cultural Revolution. Okay. So let's see here. We've got okay. So there is one thing that happens that I think it's important to understand. We talked about this report that told about the problem with the Great Leap Forward causing famine, and that it was suppressed. Well, one of the leaders actually started to talk about it and started to give this information to Mao and the party. I believe he was the head of the military at the time. I forget his name, but when he came out with this, saying that this stuff was a problem, he was relieved of duty.
Right.
And he was punished for it.
Pen Dehuai.
Yes, that's exactly who it was.
Yeah.
What do you recall of that instance? Because it later showed up as a metaphor in a Peking opera.
There was because well, he actually they had a high level retreat in a famous mountain. It's called Lushan, and the original intent to have the meetings basically for Mao to in a way to kind of self-criticize and say, okay, his was kind of too aggressive, trying to push the whole communism, the whole commune system, and so Pen Dehuai, he was circulating a report that he wrote, and that in a way, at least Mao took it as a personal attack on him. So he actually he did some maneuvering and some political politics, and so basically fired Pen, kind of, yeah.
Yeah, and if I recall, he may have found his way into a prison at one point as a result of all of that, but he was certainly removed from his position.
He was put in prison and died in a prison.
Yeah. And then a few years later, there is an opera called The Dismissal of Hai Ri from Office, I believe, or I may have that pronunciation wrong, that told the story of, as the traditional opera does, where they have ancient emperors and figures that they tell as parables for what's going on in the culture at the time. There is an official, a lower level official, that sees corruption and tries to sort it out and dismisses the corrupt people. And then the emperor himself comes and dismisses that middle level political official who was trying to fix things for, pointing out the corruption in the empire. And Mao saw this, and his wife saw this, and people started to write about it and say, this is actually something that's going on now. You see this play and the injustice done to this official. Well, that's exactly what happened with Mao dismissing because of the honest truth of what happened in this famine. And that type of dissent, can start to build momentum, and it can start to turn a populace against the people in power. And as Marxists do, they understand the power of literature and culture to shape people's minds. They want to control that power, but they're also aware of how dangerous it is for threatening their own power. And so so they saw this, and there was a series of reports. There was something called the Cultural Revolution. A lot of the times when we think about revolutions, it's the name that historians give to a conflict after the fact. In this case, Cultural Revolution was another propaganda campaign. It was another political campaign that the name was given by the people in charge of it. Mao set up, because he still had control of the party apparatus, he set up a Cultural Revolution Committee. And there was one that was formed that created a report that criticized this maker of the play, but Mao did not like how that criticism was framed. He followed it up by creating a whole new body, a whole new Cultural Revolution Committee, and they issued their own criticism of that play and denounced the prior criticism, and then gave vague accusations of people infiltrating the party itself who were trying to follow these capitalist roads rather than the Mao Zedong thought, who were more in alignment with the bourgeoisie reactionary line rather than socialist ideals. And because he didn't give a name to that, it just left this sense that we're being infiltrated by people who are not ideologically pure. And that letter that was initially published, I think it's May 16th letter, you can see it, there's a few translations. Oddly enough, the only translation I could find of it was on the Marxist website, where they translated a lot of the yeah. But it's a really fascinating read, and it talks about that play, that opera, and it talks about how we need to perceive moving forward, and it really sets the tone for we need to have a cultural revolution where we purge our party, we purge our institutions of people who aren't following the true, pure principles of Mao Zedong thought. And so that many people point to that May 16, 1966 letter as the thing that starts the Cultural Revolution. It sets the stage for people who are not party actors to start to look for and make accusations of people who are working against Mao Zedong, against their communist ideals, against, the thing that everybody loves, or that everybody's enthralled by politically. And so then we start to see some of the stuff that you described at the beginning of our discussion. We start to see college students who themselves were raised honoring Mao Zedong as this godlike figure whose
actually, at that time, Mao does not have that. That was kind of during the Cultural Revolution, he became like God. But before the Cultural Revolution, he was the first among equals. So at that time, if you look at the official newspaper, the People's Daily, they actually have not just his own portrait on that. They also have Liu Shaoqi. They all have Zhu De and Zhou Enlai. They actually got 4 portraits on the front. So he was the first of the equal. But during the Cultural Revolution, he became the only one. There's nobody equal to him.
Okay, so there was, did it kind of like ramp up how highly they revered him?
Yeah, he became a god during the Cultural Revolution.
Now, I know a lot of people that talk about schooling in the midst of the Cultural Revolution talk about how when they were first learning language, some of the first words or sentences or phrases that they would learn would be in reference to Mao Zedong, in reference to the helmsman. And
first thing you learn is long live Chairman Mao.
Yes.
The second thing is long live Chinese Communist Party.
Right. And did that thing where the pointing to him and pointing to communism in the midst of education, infusing it into all of your lessons, whether it's mathematics or English, or mathematics or language or writing or anything, did that precede the Cultural Revolution? Because I know before the Cultural Revolution, there was the socialist education projects where they kind of educated the teachers and made sure that they were teaching principles of communism and the correct political ideology. Did that pre-exist the Cultural Revolution, I guess is my question.
Definitely, there is kind of ideology, kind of brainwashing, but it's not, in a way, it's kind of, it's not drastic. And you're still going to learn the Chinese classics. You're still going to learn, about like math and like physics, which talks about like Newton, talks about, you know, those famous scientists. So it's like the way actually I got into the literature before the Cultural Revolution is, of course, is much later. It was like after Mao died. So I remember the first time I actually read those kind of things, that was just like, wow, it's totally different. I mean, it's, I mean, how to say that the whole vocabulary and all that is totally different. Just like day and night difference.
When you talk about comparing classical literature
Right.
before the Cultural Revolution, before that,
the textbooks before the Cultural Revolution and the textbooks I had during the Cultural Revolution, they are just totally kind of light and day difference.
Okay. All right. So I think we've got a couple of things to cover here. So there were people in China who believed so much in the vision of Mao that came from outside of China. One of them is a gentleman by the name of Sidney Rittenberg. He was very much in alignment with socialist communism at the time and believed that Mao was on the right path. He came and joined him and was actually part of his inner circle. And he spent a lot of time in prison because he was eventually accused of being a Western spy.
Right.
Of course, as an outsider, there was a great deal of suspicion of outsiders. But he talks a little bit about, because he was in Mao's inner circle, about how Mao contextualized why he would have allowed the things that went on to happen. And he's got a great quote that I want to cover now. Let's see if we can bring it up here. And I think that's this one.
In 1965, Mao returns for the first time to Jingyangshan, where he fought in the 1920s. To those around him, the chairman seems nostalgic. They could hardly be more wrong. As Mao gazes out at the mountain fastness where he served his revolutionary apprenticeship, he's contemplating what lies ahead.
We didn't understand it at the time, but in retrospect, he said we have to train a new generation of revolutionaries to take over from us. And the only way they can learn to be revolutionary leaders is to make revolution. Well, he didn't spell it out, but if you think about it, who were they to revolt against? His own government and party. They were the only candidates. And that's what he had them do.
It begins as a protest movement by middle school students who denounce the academic establishment and, above all, the party bureaucracy. In May, a young philosophy lecturer puts up a wall poster attacking the university authorities as reactionaries. Mao takes up the cudgels on her behalf, and the woman, Nie Yanzi, is catapulted to national prominence.
毛主席说了，这是20世纪北京公社、巴黎公社的宣言书，比巴黎公社宣言书都高明都好。报我这个我们写成大报抬这么不高，报我也抬这么高，由此我也就被抬这么高。
Nie Yanzi put up her poster here on a wall at the university that's been set aside ever since the 1950s for student debates. It marked the opening salvo of what would become known as the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, Mao's last doomed attempt to ensure that his ideas of revolution continued in China after his death. Within days, the movement caught fire like a trail of gunpowder.
All right. So we were introduced to a couple of things that we're going to see more of. One of those is that these things are originating from students in schools. And we have examples both of middle school as well as at the university level. We've got these big character posters. Now, I've done a review of a lot of cinematic reproductions where people are making movies set in the 1960s in China. And in every one of those movies, you see that the walls of like these buildings are all plastered with these huge, big character posters. What is going on with that?
Well, so basically, what the woman you saw there, and she actually was a faculty member. She was a lecturer, and she was a long-time communist. So she actually write the big poster, big character poster to attack the leadership of that university. I think it's Beijing University. And that kind of basically started in a way, started the whole thing. And
now, it strikes me that these big character posters are placed up in public areas where everyone can see. They are naming and denouncing people in the community, naming their sins and denouncing them in a way that's very public, that immediately puts these people on notice that you know that they are not pure, that they are targeted because they're not in alignment with the ideology of the day.
Right.
And
those people actually being attacked, those were the leaderships of the school. It's not like just like some kind of middle level manager or something. They are the top people who are running the school, and so they are attacking them because, because the Mao's goal is to attack Liu and Deng, who are at that time running the country and running the party.
Yeah. So all the different party apparatus under Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping are devoted to them, not to Mao. And so if these people denounce that leadership, then they can be put out, and then people who will be true to Mao's perspective will be put in their place. Those are the only ones that can survive the denunciation.
Right.
Now, I guess in the various stories that I've read, I would clarify that early on it started like that. But as this performance of denouncing people in power who then lose their position starts to make its way through the culture over the ensuing couple of years, you start to see this happen on a much smaller, petty scale, where even people who have grudges personally against other people learn that by simply making an accusation that doesn't have to be backed up by any evidence, people that they may see as rivals or who have slighted them in the past can lose their position and standing, and that starts to become a widespread phenomenon. And that's part of how this whole thing destroys the cohesion of the culture and society and makes everybody suspicious and resentful of everybody else, because everyone may be subject to that type of persecution and struggle.
And in a way, it's kind of like the French Revolution, but it's in a much bigger scale and more bloody, because once the government and the party hierarchy was turned upside down, and there is no law and order, right? And so it's become, in a way, a pure democracy. I mean, the people who just ganged up, and I mean, whoever, you got more people, then you got more power. Oh, I cannot hear you. Oh, your mic. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Your mic was muted.
Okay, I'm having some audio issues. Let me just fix this real quick.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep. So for
probably not. Let's see here. Audio.
Oh, hello.
Test 1 2. Okay.
Okay. I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I can't hear you for some reason. So let me just step out, and I will be right back. Give me a moment.
Sure.
Okay, sorry about that. I think I have you back. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, excellent. I can hear you. I apologize. My system burped and did not work after that.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So I think I was talking about what happened. There is about 2 years time. There is just chaos because the party and the government hierarchy are all dysfunctional. So there is no one there in charge, and so the whole country became, in a way, it's basically anarchy.
Yes. And when you say that's dysfunctional, it's dysfunctional by design, because we have accounts of Mao instructing local law enforcement to not interfere with the students.
Right.
And we haven't yet gotten to what the students are actually doing. So one of the things that Mao... Go ahead.
That was actually in the early days of Cultural Revolution, when there is still a government, and the law enforcement was told to, to don't get interfere, don't do anything. But eventually, all of those got being kind of overthrown, turned upside down. Then there's no one there to. So that's why there is a period of time they were just like people killing each other. Basically the red guards split into different factions. They got guns and all kinds of weapons. Then they just kill each other in the name of defending Mao.
Yes. Well, I want to get to that when we get to kind of the midsection of this revolution. Now, something that Mao does brilliantly early on is he allows students to travel through the train system to be able to go anywhere. So you have students who want to see the world. They're young, they're college, middle school age. Suddenly they can go on any train system. They can go anywhere. And of course, they want to go and see Mao, who's the person that is the embodiment of this new sense of freedom, this new liberation, where they're able kind of to stand up to the older people and feel like they're good and justified in doing so. And so there's a series of weeks where millions upon millions of young people are going to Beijing. They're filling Tiananmen Square and they want to see Mao. And the energy of that moment was captured on film. And that's where a couple of speeches are given that set the tone for the violence that follows. And I want to make sure that we include some of that. So if we go into, I think it's here. Let me make sure that I have this set up. If I hit share screen, share window, Cultural Revolution. All right, and let's add this to our stream and go here. And if you need to pause at any moment, I know we're going long. I don't know if you're used to these long format things. Okay, so let's see what we got here.
To Mao's delight, the political center of gravity in China is shifting. It no longer resides in the Central Committee. It's moved out onto the streets, onto the great square that lies before the Forbidden City. Dawn, August the 18th, 1966. Mao emerges in person to review his young supporters, 1 million or more shock troops who've responded to his call to uphold the purity of the Chinese Revolution. The Red Guards, who will soon separate into violent factions, all pledge to give their lives to defend the chairman's cause.
Wow. So I want to pause really quickly. So we're listening now to the voice of Lin Biao, who was somebody that was very close to Mao. And when the other leaders started to kind of undermine Mao, Mao brought Lin Biao in to kind of be his second-hand guy. He was his, he was going to be his successor for a while, and he had a prominent position over the military, I believe.
Right.
what he's doing now is he's giving a speech out to these throngs of millions of young people that have taken up the armband of the Red Guard and have come to see their leader. And he kind of invokes something that will become very much associated with the Cultural Revolution, which is the concept of destroying the four olds.
Right.
And that's what we're about to see here.
Right.
一定能顺利发展，一定能取得伟大的胜利。我们要打破一切剥削阶级旧思想、旧文化、旧风俗、旧习惯。我们要扫除一切害人者，办掉一切叛教事。
Lin Biao's instruction to smash all old things is relayed at Red Guard meetings throughout China. Shop signs, which the Red Guards consider bourgeois, like that of this Peking duck restaurant, are pulled down and destroyed. Street names are changed, the old ones hammered flat as though the decadence could be beaten out of them. The road running past the Russian embassy is renamed Anti-Revisionist Street. And what is done to things is also done to people.
红卫兵起来的时候就不一样了，因为那时候有抄家的运动。我和我的哥哥也去过，然后有的时候我们去说，哎，这个警察说这个家人是地主，这家人是坏人，就去抄家，去看这些这个东西。有的人看出他有这个文学上的什么象牙雕刻的《金瓶梅》。 什么这些的，说啊，有这么黄色的书籍，还用象牙雕刻出来，这是很怎么样。
This unique black and white footage has lain hidden for almost 40 years, most of it never seen before except by the Chinese police and a handful of top leaders. It provides an authentic picture of the ideological witch hunt that the Cultural Revolution was becoming, directed against former landlords, capitalists, and anyone else with the wrong class background.
这个当时那个 police 啊，就是告诉我们地址，当时那个派出所的片警，他都给我们提供这个名单，哪是私类分子的家的地址，完了让我们去抄去。 因为当时这种抄家的行为啊，不是特有严密组织的啊，都是那个脑子一热就去抄去。当时我们学校，因为我们学校在郊区，离的城里很远，我们主要是抄附近的那个农村的地主家，还有打死了好多也不少。啊，都是初中小孩干的，我们高中的干的少，初中小孩干的。 把我们学校附近的农村的地主，基本上都打光了，消灭光了。
毛主席教导我们，革命要靠自己，我们要自己教育自己，自己解放自己，自己起来搞革命。无论是北京市的革命师生，还是各地的革命师生，在无产阶级文化大革命中，我们要打破资产阶级的思想，打理无产阶级思想，也就是打理毛泽东思想。中国共产党万岁！战无不胜的毛泽东思想万岁！我们伟大的领袖毛主席万岁！万岁！
红卫兵打人的时候，
So I wanted to make sure that I included all of that imagery, all of that, the pomp, because it's something that is almost spiritual. You can see it in the faces of the people who are there. The object of their adulation, the shaper of their ideology is calling upon them to purge anything that is unclean. It drives it's almost like a moral righteous indignation that they are able to feel justifies any of the invasions and attacks that they then undergo, and is so powerful.
Yeah.
Had any of this, like, how did this end up showing up where you were? Had it died down? Had it muted itself by the time you entered school?
You mean the Red Guards?
Well, I mean, just kind of the intensity. You can see it's almost like, like people, like young kids at a Beatles concert. They're just like, it's this crazed excitement. Was that still a hallmark of it, or had that aspect of it died down?
Well, Mao actually did a pretty smart thing. He actually told the Red Guards to go to the countryside.
Okay. Okay. No, you're that is a very important part of this whole thing, but let's hold off on the countryside thing till we get to that, because we got to get to.
So Mao used those kids, those youth, used their energy to overturn the government, so that he got rid of his political enemies or rivals or whatever he thought was kind of his threat. And now he's the government, right? Now when you're the government, you have to maintain some orders.
Yes.
So how do you maintain that order? And also during those 2 years, there's no production going on. I mean, people has to eat, right? You have to revive the economy. So what he did is he actually told the Red Guards and say, okay, now you have, we have such a great victory, and now it's time for you actually go to the countryside and to
learn from the people, learn from the peasants, learn from the workers that represent who we stand for.
Right, because you want to go pure, right? I mean, you have to go to learn from the farmers and the workers, and especially the farmers, because he doesn't want the Red Guard to stay in the cities. So he said, okay, you just go as far as you can, go to the countryside. So there's a huge,
that's a whole other chapter, and the people who survived that then came on and told what that experience was like are some of the most powerful voices today, talking about how they realized what it meant to be used politically and then discarded as though their lives meant nothing, and they became very disillusioned with the contrast between the devotion that they felt for Mao and how he so easily trashed their lives. But before we get to that, though, I think let's continue with this thread, because one of the key quotes from that early segment that we have is that the things that were done to statues, to signs, to objects very soon were done to people. And this is, I think, why we're starting to see now people invoke the Cultural Revolution, because when we look at what has taken place in the last year, we've seen in America, in Western countries, mass protests. We've seen tearing down signs, renaming streets, all with a particular ideology that is driving it, and with a concept of our culture that says that what we name things, statues that we keep space for in our communities, means something to the extent that we have to tear them down and replace them in alignment with this ideology. And so it's so important to understand how that precedes doing it to people. And that's what we're going to start to see now. So let's take a look.
中央领导都知道，但是中央还出面向高喊，向红卫兵小将学习，向红卫兵小将致敬。
Zhou Enlai's implicit distinction between smashing bourgeois ideas and smashing bourgeois individuals is quickly forgotten. Over the next few weeks, tens of thousands of people in Beijing are harangued and severely beaten. Many hundreds die.
我特别记得清楚，有一个是我们高中3年级跟我同年级的一个，平常是练习功夫的这种学生，跳上台上去打这个校长。斗争会下来，我觉得完全看不出来他还是一个人，完全是不知道是一个什么东西，打的就是整个面部你分不出来他的器官了，整个是黑色的，打得非常之惨。当时我觉得这一幕惊心动魄。
当时这个盛行的一句毛主席语录就是“革命不是请客吃饭，不是绘画绣花，不能那样雅致，那样温良恭俭让。革命是暴动，是一个阶级推翻一个阶级的暴力行动。”这句话非常 popular。
This was the spirit that was encouraged the first year of the Cultural Revolution. The army was told, hands off. The police were told, hands off. And Mao said, let the young champions make their own mistakes, learn from their own mistakes, and correct themselves. We can't stand behind them and point and criticize. So it was a great free-for-all.
Yeah. And I think now what you saw in those images where there was just a huge mass of people surrounding people who had been called out for being impure ideologically, for trying to be capitalist, or came from a family that had a degree of wealth in the past, or, you know, were a landlord in the past. Even if you were a peasant and you worked hard and saved up and had a little bit more because of your extra effort, you were considered a wealthy peasant who was an aspiring capitalist. And so you were called out and demonized. And it's not just that you were criticized, it's that you were publicly shamed and denounced. And if you held to the ideology of Mao Zedong thought, you kind of felt that you perhaps were a bad person. And if you're in this society culture, you don't have any other ideas other than what is surrounding you, and your entire community is condemning you as a bad element, and that it's something that's so bad that it's passed to your children, then you lose hope for life. And if they haven't beat you themselves to death, you may see that life is hopeless, and rather than subject yourself to more torture, you may commit suicide. And these stories of suicide, torture, murder in this social context are starting to just emerge all over the place, starting in Beijing, around that area, and then pervading throughout the nation.
Exactly. And actually, at that time, that's how what I call the tyranny of democracy is because people decide, the majority decide what to do with certain people. Yeah, so they always have, they call the, it's a mass court, kind of like a, and so people there basically saying, they will say, okay, what are we going to do with this guy? And then people say, okay, let's kill him. Who the loudest voice win that day.
The mob, it's mob justice. The mob, you know, all that's required is an accusation, and then everybody is shouting. It becomes a performance where everybody is competing to be more revolutionary than the person before them, and that drives you to more and more extremes of action. This person says, well, I'm going to pull his hair and you know, shave half of his head, and the other says, well, I'm going to do something even worse, and it just escalates and escalates until they end up killing. And we just see story after story of this. There is something, just so that you understand, I think for my audience, we start to hear people talk about struggle sessions, and this gets invoked in the modern day term of cancel culture. And people who lived through the Cultural Revolution are saying, wait a second, there's something about these public denunciations on an ideological lines that serve to shame people, that then lead to mass people on Twitter piling on and saying, well, let's find out where they work, and then let's tell their employer that they are such and such. They are bad, they're evil, they're racist, they're bigots. Let's try to get him fired. You know, and the psychological feeling of that the entire world or the entire community, if you're canceled and your inboxes and your private messages are filled with hundreds of people who are denouncing you, saying that you're a bad person, that you're, not worthy of love or goodness, then it bears a psychological toll. And we have stories even today of people who have been canceled and subject to that psychological bombardment from their community or the worldwide community, who go on to commit suicide.
Wow.
And that's not, there are even instances where people lose their employment because of these mob activities. Yeah. So you have everything from minor actions to very, very major actions.
And also the thing is that this thing can get out of control. And at the first, people think, okay, it won't affect me, right? I'm not that rich.
Yeah.
I'm not that. But sooner or later, they will get you. I mean, unless you prove that you are more radical than they are. So that became, whole thing become crazy.
And the game becomes then you've got to accuse someone before you get accused. And then not only that, but if you accuse someone now, you may still be subject to accusations later. And if you could see, just take this set of circumstances and imagine how it projects onto a broad society, and realize that it creates a society where nobody can trust anyone else.
Right.
Everybody is suspicious and paranoid. No one wants to actually share their real thoughts and opinions. Nobody can share any diversity of opinion or thought because they leave themselves vulnerable to accusations, particularly when there's this strong ideology that cuts through the society and culture that shuts down any other perspective.
Right.
That's exactly what's going on there. Now, there's something very, as we talked about, very religious about Mao and the institutions and the culture that's set up as the communists take power, as the Cultural Revolution starts to then clear away any of the old traditions. And in addition to street signs, shop signs, and people, another aspect of the Cultural Revolution was taking the centuries, thousands of years old traditions, religions, and older cultures of China that would compete with Maoism and destroying them and blanking them out of history. One of the things that George Orwell is so good at articulating is the power of authoritarian states to try to blank out history and reduce history and to insert itself into anything that might hold any space of devotion in the minds of the people other than the state, the government, the authority and control. And so one of the things that happened is that there were still temples and religious orders that existed at the time of the Cultural Revolution. A lot of them had been minimized and done away with as the communists took power, but there were still pockets of Christians and pockets of people who were Buddhist and followers of Confucius. And the Red Guards, these fanatic, idealistic youth who saw the world in very black or white terms, who were very naive and were being used by Mao, who understood the power he held over their minds, were then sent out to do away with the four olds, old cultures, old traditions, old customs, old habits, old ideas. And that included all of these traditions. Now, traditions, whether they're religious or philosophical, that evolve and last through centuries and are part of communities, the very fact that they have survived that long tells you that they have an element of cohesion and replicability. They keep societies and communities together. They don't form the type of complete dissolution and devolvement that happened in the Cultural Revolution. So we see that happening where they've demonized these religions, saying that they're against, our great future in Mao Zedong thought. And let's see some examples of that. All right, so we've got this, and let's go here. And
one of the quotations from Mao that was most popular on the part of the rebels was that without destruction, there's no construction. First destroy, and on the basis of the destruction will arise something new. So it was destroy and then see. And then it has to become a better world. And of course it didn't. It became a much worse world.
The physical destruction wrought by the Red Guards was unparalleled even in China's long history. Monasteries all over the country, as far away as distant Tibet, were ransacked and razed to the ground. The most important sites, like the Forbidden City, were protected on the orders of Zhou Enlai. But elsewhere, Mao's stormtroops had free rein.
So weird seeing these statues, many of which are hundreds of years old,
Thousands.
just get destroyed.
Thousands of rare
Yeah.
books, some of them unique editions,
And
were consigned to the
Confucius'
flames.
grave was destroyed.
However radical they may be, all revolutions build in the image of what they destroy. As the old Confucian orthodoxy was damned, new Maoist rituals took its place. Telephone operators in the Cultural Revolution, instead of saying hello, greeted callers with the words, "Long live Chairman Mao." And in the countryside, pigs had the character loyal branded on their flanks to show that even brute beasts appreciated the chairman's genius.
All ideas contrary to Mao's thinking and the objects that represent them have to be destroyed. Not just Confucianism and Buddhism, but even more so foreign faiths like Christianity. Throughout the country, churches are closed, clergy unfrocked, religious symbols smashed. The statue of the Virgin Mary is replaced by a portrait of Mao. One form of worship succeeds another. This is not simply the cult of a leader, it's a full-blown religion. A religion in its most naive and primitive stage of development, complete with miracle plays and feudal superstitions. Each day, all Chinese, even the blind and deaf mutes, must seek guidance from Mao's works. The ceremony is called seeking instruction in the morning and reporting in the evening. From the humblest railway employee to the highest in the land, every Chinese has to show at each moment that they're imbued with love for Mao.
I love the point that they make there, that these revolutions rebuild in the image of what they tear down.
Right.
You know, human societies and culture have a need for the things that, you know, religion has really fulfilled in them, whether it's a community, a purpose, a ritual, some way of doing it. And if you look at the history of many of these religions early on, they become radicalized. They become what we describe as puritanical, where, you know, you have standards of what it is to be good and righteous, and they go in extremes and they start to purge things. And then I think you can look at the sort of the landscape of a lot of religions and they back away from that, you know, and there's this sense in Christian communities that there was this old notion that people, you know, went down this puritanical line, but a more commonly accepted notion now that Christ is the only one who's perfect. We are all imperfect, and it takes away the justification that you would have to go down that pathway that we see happening, that there's no brakes on it in the Cultural Revolution. You know, you can accuse someone of being imperfect ideologically speaking, and that accusation stands on its own just simply because you've made it. There's no moderating influence ideologically other than whatever Mao says. He holds total control ideologically. Any thoughts on what we just saw with regard to destroying these old cultures and old traditions? You're right. I'm saying hundreds. I should be saying thousands of years old.
Yeah, it's totally destruction. It's just wiped clean. So when I was starting school, basically, anything before the Cultural Revolution is it's gone. I mean, it's all we know is some bad things, right? Nothing's good before the Cultural Revolution, and Mao is the savior. You know, Mao actually was worshipped as a god, as the god actually. So, yeah, it's really during the Cultural Revolution, what we went through is really just like what he said. It's a religion. I mean, everything's like that. I mean, basically, Chairman Mao's words became, his.
His words were truth. They were the divine truth.
Yeah. I mean, basically, whatever the book he wrote, those are the Bible, right?
Well, I mean, that's a brilliant point, and that leads us into our next thing, which is you see in all these pictures. So there's a couple of things visually that come to mind when you invoke the Cultural Revolution. One of them is the armbands. Yeah. The other is the big character posters. But one of the most conspicuous things is the little red book. So let's watch a little bit about that. And when I was set up above, we got started late because I had technical issues. I had my own copy of the little red book, but it's in my upstairs.
Okay. Well,
you don't happen to have one with you, do you?
We have to memorize, basically recite his work. So I'm still kind of, to this day, I still remember some of that.
Well, it's probably a little bit. So I know. I mean, the things that we become indoctrinated with as kids just kind of become part of us, and they pop out every once in a while. We just can't forget it. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at what they have to say about the Little Red Book. All right, here we go.
This is the time the Little Red Book becomes the indispensable fashion accessory for every right-thinking Chinese, for the Red Guards and for their leaders, with the sole exception of the chairman himself. Compiled by Lin Biao from Mao's writings as a set of moral maxims for the army, it quickly became a breviary of revolutionary virtue for the country at large. For the fortunate few, the nec plus ultra is a little red book signed by Mao himself.